Well, Ellie, I'm glad you're joining because the first part I think you will have more context on maybe than anyone. So, anyways, I'm Vivek. Everyone, we've all met now. I work at Gitcoin. Spend my time predominantly on Gitcoin. Co-founder of the project. I've enjoyed building open source incentives for people to work. And continue to think about different ways to incentivize people to do more in the open source space. The other thing I'm doing is I'm working a little bit on the Ethereum Foundation grants team, which is kind of a ragtag group of people that's trying to coordinate all of the inbound grant applications that are associated with Ethereum. So that's been another fun way to interact with the open source community. But I'm not going to talk really about those things much today. I'll talk about Web3 and open networks, but I'm glad that it's good that there's a small group because it's really just to talk about how we feel about what we're doing here and the different kind of ways that this can go, maybe. And so, Ellie, I'm curious, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Athens.
In Athens,
yeah.
Okay.
But I live in Berlin for the last 7 years.
Last 7 years. Okay, cool. So I was walking around and took this picture on the right, the 1990 picture. I just saw it when I was walking around Berlin. It's my second time here. And I found the first picture on the internet, which is kind of the building of the wall, and then eventually the takedown of the wall, which was only in 1990, which kind of strikes me as an outsider as something that's it wasn't that long ago. It was 30 years ago.
It was very recent.
Very recent. And it, in fact, was the same year that the Tim Berners-Lee paper came out about information management and the kind of seeds of the web. And so the question that I thought comes up, since information management, things have happened. Google has come, many other Web 2 companies have come. We've gone through a few iterations of the web. And I won't show this video now, but there's a really good video on the internet called "The Machine Is Us." And that's what this is drawing from. It's a video from about 2006, one of the earliest YouTube videos, and it talks about how we are building the web ourselves. There's a lot of open questions. There's things like privacy and governance and how we're going to do things as a community. And I just thought it was interesting because we're talking about the same things 10 years later. But the first question that I'm curious to get opinions on from the group is, it's been 30 years since 1990, almost. What would it be like for the people in East Berlin if the wall was rebuilt today? Do we feel like they would have a better opportunity to coordinate or to communicate or anything as a result of the technologies that have been built in the last 30 years?
We're all quiet. Well, I mean,
I think the reason is I can't understand why you want to rebuild the wall today.
That's true. Of course, yeah. But let's say, it's not really up to us, right? I do think obviously political environments have changed, and it's not very likely that this exact scenario will come up. But if it were to come up, the real question is about the tools that we've built. How strong are those tools? What could they do? Just today, if it happened tomorrow and we had to figure out a way with what we have available, maybe Telegram is what we have now and WhatsApp, and we can use these tools to communicate better, and that's obviously a benefit. But there's other things those tools aren't fully private, and there's ways through your ISP or through different sources that information still could be tracked today. So definitely, I think there's an improvement, but it's just kind of an interesting thought experiment to say, perhaps not fully there yet, fully where we would want.
Yeah. What I'm wondering is, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I want to say what I'm wondering is that I think what's exciting with the internet, obviously today versus 1989, is that we have seen these experiments, these human coordination experiments on the internet at a scale that we probably never saw at the time, right? Take the example of Wikipedia and take obviously the open source movement and all of that. So obviously we have evidence that human coordination has progressed. The question that I'm asking myself is how much is that? What's so different between that and now? Yeah, I was thinking of doing the same thing.
Yeah.
It's going to be a circle. So that's one thought that I have, which is quite
Yeah.
an answer.
Yeah. So the coordination is probably on like a 10x or a 100x scale of what it's ever been in the last 30 years.
Well, the thing is, it's an arms race as well because the surveillance technology has gone up by that much
Totally.
or more.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's true.
Totally, no, absolutely. Like I mean, starting like fact-based, evidence-based, etc. Yes, we have on the one side all of this experiment and this experiment that actually show that we progress somehow human coordination. On the other side, he's definitely right. Like we also have this big cloudy, darkness on the side,
Yeah.
and we also don't understand that well. So
Right.
yeah,
It's growing.
that's why it's an open question. Otherwise, I would be very tempted to say yes. Like we can coordinate better than before, but it's an arms race.
It is an arms race. That's a really good point. That's a really good point. Yeah. So, one question in. We have maybe a few to come. This is Juan Benet's talk. I thought it was a really fantastic talk. He walked through the internet, and I don't know how many of you guys read Juan's talk. Did you see it?
No.
Did you guys see Juan's talk? Okay, so
Yeah,
Juan Benet, he's the creator of IPFS, and he's working on Filecoin. He talked about the kind of the ways that the web has changed over time. You have the internet, there was the networking, then you had Web 1, which was the read-only web, and then things became more interactive with things like Google and Facebook, and now people are writing information to the web almost all the time. And then now we have Web 3, which is this idea and this movement around trust verifiability. So the ability to know that anything that you write to an application is validated, and you are able to understand that this computing is done in a way that you can yourself go out and make sure it was done correctly. So the best quote, I think this is from Gav, consider Web 3.0 to be an executable Magna Carta, the foundation of freedom of the individual against the arbitrary authority of the despot. So this kind of speaks to the arms race that you're talking about, right? Like how to better get an individual in a position to protect themselves in a situation like a tough one. Yeah. So what is Web3? We can have this discussion if you guys have kind of opinions or thoughts or questions on it.
I'm touching a bit on my talk at 10:45, but I love the definition that Juan used, this idea of bringing together decentralized web and blockchain. I actually always try to say that people that try to
Put them together.
Blockchain equals decentralized web. That's very wrong. Actually, there are fascinating peer-to-peer experiments and technologies that fit the decentralized purpose much better than the blockchain does, in a sense. So the definition that Juan gave, which is Web3 equals decentralized web, meaning primarily P2P stuff, plus blockchain plus linked data, I think is actually quite good.
Yeah. The linked data stuff, that was really cool. I like how he brought that back in.
The semantic,
the semantic
web in a sense.
Yeah, and that's a cool sub area to check out. That's kind of like Tim Berners-Lee's latest experiment, one that didn't go as well, but maybe we can work on as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different definitions. These are just a few. Data to users, the censorship resistance, global interactivity, self-sovereign identity, and then Juan's being the read-write, trust-verifiable web. So now the question becomes, if 30 years pass and we are successful in what we have worked on, what changes? Are we able to do better than we did today? Is there a 30-year improvement? What improves as a result of Web3?
Tough to say. No one knows the future. I mean, there's a lot of optimism, and I think what's different is right now is that there's a lot of money on the space. That previously wasn't the case, right? Now, how we're gonna use that to be seen, there are positive and negative, a lot of negative examples as well. So I think we need to be pragmatic that we have a chance, and we managed to bring, I think, some of these topics like privacy and censorship resistance back to the mainstream. I think that's an accomplishment of the space. Now, how we're gonna manage to translate that into the Web 3 of the 2049? This is where the purpose comes in, and our responsibility in a sense, I think.
Yeah. Very true. Yeah. I think like, you can imagine a future where communication is more private. There's the ability to self-organize. There's mesh networks that are usable, and these types of things make it even easier to kind of make your own decisions regardless of geographically where you are.
Yep.
But this is like the forcing function question, I think, to ask, is like in the most dire of times, which again, only 30 years ago this existed in the place that we stand today. What are we building? Is it helping in that greater goal when we say things like censorship resistance?
Right. You can also imagine to just add the counterbalance that you can imagine also a world where basically there's the Chinese coin that basically like you have this dystopian future where all of these technologies that we just now bring into the mainstream are used exactly against us, right? Like everything now is like surveillance is at a new scale and everything is trackable, and this is also a very real alternative. I think it could become.
Yeah, I'm very glad you brought that up. That gives a good segue into the next section, which is like how should networks be governed, and I'm not gonna get too much into like the governance stuff. I think Vlad wrote a great article, and Elliot, whenever you need to go, don't.
I'll go and
I started this from an article that was written last year, which is called "No Gods, No Masters, No Code: The Future of Sovereignty." It's a really good article, not hard to read, maybe like 3 or 4 pages, but it's a paper, that was written, and it kind of lays out these like 5 futures that all are very much possible with the tools and the primitives we're building in Web3. And so LA just referred to one, which is the surveillance state, which very much could happen with the same tools that we're building. And to your point, it's an arms race, and this can easily happen. But let's like kind of assume that that's not one that we want, right? Like that's not in a best case scenario, that's not what we want. But even amongst the other 4, I think there's like pros and cons to each that it's unclear in Web3 what we want. There's people that want different things, which is good and healthy, but I think we have work to define the differences between them and how they can interact with each other, and I think that's maybe worth spending some time doing. So I'm going to avoid that, or at least for now, kind of assume that we don't want the surveillance state option, and perhaps we can talk through some of these different ones. So individual sovereignty is one of these. You have perhaps the libertarian ideal of being able to be a self-fulfilling entrepreneur, to do what you want in a geography, or between geographies, to move between different organizations kind of as fits best for you. So that might be a pro. Anyone want to wager any other pros or cons to the individual sovereignty approach? Should this be the largest of them?
So at the most extreme, individual sovereignty can lead to dangerous outcomes in the sense that you don't necessarily have a way to tax or manage common goods. Obviously, there's like lots of people in space that think taxation is not really a good thing. But whether you call it taxation or not, there needs to be some maintenance mechanism. And so I think that depending on how you define individual sovereignty, like there's an issue of how do you actually maintain those goods.
Right.
Yeah, it's the balance between the individual and the collective.
So I want to touch on that balance, because that really is kind of the next one, which is like building the commons, ensuring support for the commons and societal necessities. There's a lot of talk in the space in tandem with this like self-sovereign view. You have this let's solve the tragedy of the commons view, which is frankly a lot of what we're doing at Gitcoin, and I'm sure Uscoin's thinking about this with open source, which has traditionally been underfunded. And so like I'm trying to bring these two what seem like extreme different views, divergent views, but somehow are both being expressed in our space, and say like, okay, like, well, how are we going to balance between these? Is it that we allow experiments in both areas to flourish, or should they try to come together? I don't know.
I think that's the part that I'm personally most fascinated with, which is finally we can run these experiments. Like we're seeing experiments already today, like in each of these areas, right? So I see it more as an evolutionary mechanism that hopefully will lead to us learning what works and what doesn't. With the pace that we weren't able to do before. Because I think especially with the commons, like what's very different today is this idea of we controlling currencies now, and Sparkling Music control monetary policies, which means that you can indeed like tax stuff as and direct basically some of the some economic value in your economy to different actors that previously you weren't. So I'm optimistic about that.
Yeah,
in a sense, yeah.
The fact that so many experiments can grow, and from there now we have more options. Yeah, no, that's fair. Cool. So building the commons, similar. We can probably think of some pros and cons. Here's one that I think usually is kind of written off. At least I would say within the 600 person circle that we're in here. The ability for, I'd say this. So corporations have had roles in society that perhaps are too large, perhaps have gotten out of hand. That's one way to look at it. But what's the optimal size of a corporation? Is it one person? Is it three people? Is it okay that there are some functions that require 1,000 to 2,000 people? And are there ways that the trust verifiable web can bring corporations in check, make them still a valuable institution within a society that we have? This is something that seems to be almost not talked about and kind of like cast off in the pure technology circles that I tend to run in. But I'm curious what the takes are on this worldview where with new primitives, with the trust verifiable web, as Juan put it, the corporate entities are still there, but are more we're more able to transparently understand what they're doing.
Yeah, personally, corporations aren't going anywhere. Like they're going to be there. It's just that, like again, you need to look at the evolution of open protocols and how corporations play on top of that. Take the classic example of like, okay, GitHub building a great business on top of GitHub open protocol, right? So, they will be, the corporations will be around, and there's a reason why they exist. It's just probably that if indeed some of this core internet infrastructure is transformed and is now ruled by these blockchains, then they're going to have a different role around it. But again, they're not good.
When you say different, do you think smaller? Do you think
smaller? I mean, it's really tough. Like especially the whole conversation around on-chain governance. I think specifically like Vlad and Vitalik and all of these people that are so negative against that is because they see the evolution of blockchains becoming corporations. Basically, this whole idea of like coin voting, it's identical to stakeholder voting in a sense, right? So there's nothing different there. So there's a future that basically blockchains become actually at the core, like multi.
Yeah. So and now you've gotten to the last of the ones. Ellie's beating the conversation. No, it's good. It's great. I mean, like it's true, and this is something that I think is an unsolved problem, right? Like governance itself, whether it's coin holder voting or stakeholder voting, really within Ethereum space or elsewhere, we have to just decide or determine like, how much of a role are we going to play in being a part of the governance process, or how much can we allow the governance process to be done by the individual entities that are building on top of Ethereum, and how much can that be separated? Are there ways to separate that? I think yesterday we had an interesting conversation at dinner. Dean Angman, who works on ENS, was talking about how he could imagine a future where in Ethereum you have many different shards, all that have their own governance structures, all that have their own ways of thinking about stakeholder voting, on-chain governance, off-chain governance, and they can make those decisions for themselves. Maybe that's one shard for a smaller thing, maybe that's 6 shards for something that's larger, but by coordinating themselves, you put less onus on the larger kind of Ethereum validator community or the Ethereum the group of Ethereum magicians to have to make those types of decisions. Again, pros and cons in that structure too, but that's the other one that kind of came up here. So yeah, so that's kind of this subsection, I think, mostly. What time are we at? We're at 10:30. So yeah, so this one is more about just like how we should treat each other in this new model. It's not one where we are just all working for one company and kind of have to focus on that. It's very much a model, at least for the ones who are building, that this is an open network. And so we have this graphic from the Gitcoin network where which we think is kind of a microcosm of a lot of things that are happening in Ethereum, where we have people working on Gitcoin, we have people working on MetaMask, on Ethereum, and this image is old. There's probably many more connections at this point. And to be very clear, these are developers who have contributed code to all of these different projects. And as you notice, there's connections. There's people who have worked on many of them and have interacted in different ways. And pretty much anyone who I've talked to who's been in the space for a year or a year and a half is wearing 3 or 4 hats of some nature. And as a result, this community is much more inclusive, and there's something really exciting about that, but also different. So we've taken some time to think about how we interact, and so the most important thing, especially given we're all on the internet most of the time, is that we all are 3D humans who have our own motivations, our own goals, and our own ways of thinking about these things. And as referenced in the previous section, people can have extremely divergent views and still be interested in Ethereum. And the broader political economy and kind of the things that are happening in the world today in politics are not really represented in the Ethereum space unless you spend too much time on Twitter. I think there's better, more productive conversations, and we need to think about each other as such. So just to dive in a little bit, I'm not going to talk too much about this. I think everyone knows it. So we have intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, which is both driving any 3D human that exists when you want to do something because it's interesting, and then when you want something for some type of external reward. To kind of dive into that, we wrote about this in the context of Gitcoin, where we are introducing extrinsic rewards into an area, open source software, that has traditionally been intrinsic first. And so we wanted to make sure that if we were to introduce this reward, we were not taking away from intrinsic motivations that these software developers would have to contribute towards projects. So there's a great paper written, I think, by some folks at Princeton about how to kind of balance these different types of rewards. And so here was kind of a summary of that, was this triangle of work, which says that an individual wants to work on things that have an impact, that compensate, and that align with values. And that's the most sustainable way to motivate people in the long term, is something that hits all 3 parts of that triangle of work. So for the Gitcoin context, that's something that we think about in terms of how we build the platform, showing people these projects that they're working on, whether it be MetaMask or Ethereum. What is this project? And it's not, it's not just this disparate task that you're working on and getting paid for. It's also this community that you can join and be a part of, and that's something that we have a unique opportunity to do, is be extremely radically inclusive to anyone who wants to contribute. And that's a beautiful thing about open source software that isn't traditionally the case. If somebody wants to contribute to a corporation, it's very difficult to just walk in and do something good. But in the context of open source, we have this unique opportunity to let people in and tell them how to do so. So this is a good quote from Jameson: "If you want to build a ship, don't drum up people to collect wood. Rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea." And within the Ethereum space, there's just so many things to work on. Like, you can find so many different options to get involved. So we think we have to be mission driven. This one was interesting though, because in the micro level, Gitcoin's very focused on growing open source, so that's something that we talk about a lot. I think it's probably best, personally, that the Ethereum Foundation hasn't come out and said, this is explicitly our mission. I think that for people to build on Ethereum and to build around Ethereum and in this decentralized web, and to therefore put forth their opinions. Thanks for joining us. That's the best way, I think, for this ecosystem to operate. So still something to keep in mind. And I think, I know we're a bit early here, but I think I'll end pretty quickly with how we should express ourselves. So it's a pretty simple image. This is, at least, it's supposed to be an image of the Socratic method and the conversations that happened way back when people were talking about ideas and making sure that they gave the proper room for argument and structured thought, while also being with each other, around each other, and thinking about it thinking of each other as humans. So I think it's easy in today's political environment to not engage in political conversation, especially coming from maybe a technology background. But there's a lot of interesting political conversations that are being had that have philosophical roots, that have economic roots, that require you to become a well-informed individual, but also require your opinion. Because if you're here now, you're here before 99% of people if this goes right. So everyone's opinion is important. So with that, thank you guys for joining. I appreciate it, especially early in the morning, first talk of the day. So thank you. If you guys have any questions, want to talk, just hang out. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. What'd you think?
I like the autonomous idea about the nodes.
The nodes?
Yeah, because you have different groups having different interests.
Mhm.
So